Now, when ransomware as a service was introduced to the cybercrime landscape in the mid-2010s, it significantly lowered the entry bar for cybercriminals. Security researcher Tim Mitchell, like Rafe just mentioned, is going to share with us why understanding and tracking everyone involved is important, regardless of the variant. Tim, you have magically appeared in the studio next to me, replacing Rafe. It's very sneaky how we do it. It's great to have you up here. So listen, it's now your kingdom. You've got your PowerPoint slides on your right, and I'm going to give you the floor.
Great. Thanks very much, Jules. Cheers. So yeah, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name's Tim Mitchell, and as Jules just said, I'm going to talk about ransomware as a service, or the ransomware ecosystem specifically. So the individuals that operate in that ecosystem and how the attribution of their activity is really important in understanding the threat and then ultimately for us to protect our clients. So there are three core elements in the ecosystem. Firstly, we have the operators and developers, and these are really the kind of core function of the ransomware. Operators run the business side of the operations. So that means they negotiate with victims. They also manage payment. And in the case of name and shame ransomware, they also manage the leak site that reveals the victim names. Developers, well, they obviously write the ransomware and they're responsible for innovations that improve its effectiveness. And of course, they also write the decryption tools that you would supposedly get should you pay the ransom. So ransomware can be a private operation, in which case that core group of individuals perform the ransomware deployment, or it can be offered as ransomware as a service. And as Jules mentioned, that opened up the scope to some fairly low technical criminals. So this is where we see affiliates. Affiliates gain access to organizations and they deploy the ransomware. And in the case of name and shame, they will also exfiltrate data. Interestingly, of course, like any market in the ransomware ecosystem, the top tier operators attract the best affiliates and vice versa. In addition to those two, you now have initial access brokers. So initial access brokers work with affiliates or the operators to provide initial access. And they tend to specialize in very specific areas. So one group of initial access brokers may simply target a specific vulnerability through scan and exploit, while others may harvest credentials or use stolen credentials and sell those. And again, there's a higher premium to be paid for higher value access at higher value organizations. So by higher value access, I mean higher privileged accounts, and higher value organizations may be organizations with a higher revenue. But why does it matter who does what? Why is it important to attribute this? Well, we very often get asked the question, how do I detect lockbit ransomware? But obviously, by the time you've detected the ransomware, it's very often too late to do anything about it. So attribution allows us to answer this much more pertinent question. How can I detect precursor activity at the earliest possible stage to give me the time to react? If we know which groups are responsible for specific behaviors early in the kill chain, we can predict what might come down the track and when that might happen. And it's that understanding that gives us the time to detect and prevent. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to talk through the activities of three different groups based on observations we've made in incident response engagements. And obviously that access gives us some great insight into their TTPs. The first group I'm going to talk about is a group we called Gold Melody, and they are an initial access broker. The second is Gold MATADOR, and they're an affiliate or a partner of the Hive Ransomware as a Service scheme. And the last group is Gold Hideaway, and Gold Hideaway and please do have a look at those if you want to know more. So we first observed Gold Melody activity in 2020 ourselves, but there is reporting in open source that suggests they were active as early as July 2021. Although when they produced their reporting, they didn't link the groups together as the same entity. We haven't actually seen any activity ourselves of ransomware activity, but it has been reliably reported by CrowdStrike that precursor activity that was observed did lead to different threat actors deploying egregor and Mount Locker ransomware. And it was alerted when the Secureworks SecOps team identified hands-on activity. The exact method of entry wasn't definitively established. However, there was a JBoss installation on the FlexNet server that was running a version of Log4j that was vulnerable to that vulnerability there, 4104. And it was surmised that that was possibly the entry point. Interestingly, other open source reporting suggests that the group have also exploited other Log4j vulnerabilities, remote code execution vulnerabilities, such as 444228, which is obviously much better known as Log4Shell. So once they'd established themselves on the FlexNet server, Gold Melody uploaded a base64 encoded web shell and decoded it using a PowerShell script. And this PowerShell script was generated by the Burp Suite extension CollabFiltrator. This web shell gave the group backdoor access to the server. So having established the backdoor, Gold Melody ran reconnaissance commands to identify user details and details about the network. And they also created a folder for tool staging in the Windows temp folder. Note the folder name. This is important and we'll come back to it. They then used the wget utility, specifically the T command, which enables the download of a resource from a specified URL. And in this case, they downloaded the 7-zip archiving tool to their staging server, staging folder. So the next step involved the threat actor downloading and executing the auditunnel reverse tunneling tool. This tool supports SOC2 proxy connections and was used to connect to a hard-coded IP address. We didn't actually observe any further communications, no code execution through it. The threat actor then created a new admin user account, and they added that to the administrators and remote desktop users groups. They created it using that password, and again, that's interesting, so we'll come back to that later. Having done this, the threat actor started scanning the environment, presumably with a view to laterally moving on to other hosts. And to do this, they used a tool called TX Port Map, which scans for open server message block ports on 445. And the use of SMB is a well-established method of lateral movement. So I'm now going to look at the separate intrusions that we identified Gold Melody activity on, and there were five in total. And I'm going to talk through the commonalities that we identified across the kill chain. And I'd like to credit Mark Bernard for his fantastic work on this research. So Gold Melody exclusively scan and exploit vulnerabilities for initial access onto networks. On the engagement I just described, they obviously looked at vulnerabilities on a FlexNet server exploiting Log4j. We've also seen them exploit Oracle services, including eBusiness and WebLogic, and also a Sitecore server, and a vulnerability in the Apache Struts framework. Third-party reporting into the group's activity indicates exploitation also of Oracle, but in addition to Citrix Sharefile and a Log4j vulnerability in mobile Iron Core. Persistence, Gold Melody have relied on Java JSP web shells for the persistent backdoor access. Interestingly, in both the oldest and the newest engagements, one in July 2020 and the other in July 2022, the threat actor used the same user account with the exact same password, which you might recognize from previous slides. So for tool staging, in 4 of the 5 intrusions, we saw Gold Melody establish tool staging directories. And in 2 intrusions, they created a folder with exactly the same name and exactly the same location in the Windows temp folder. In another case, they created a tool staging folder with a very similar name, and it was probably similar enough to suggest a possible typo, with the threat actor hitting the 8 key rather than the 7 key. In every intrusion, the threat actor used a wget utility in the form of a binary file called wget.bin to retrieve files from remote servers. And in 3 cases, they downloaded the 7-zip archiving tool to the tool staging folder, which was likely used for defense evasion. So patterns in credential access were less obvious. However, in the first 2 engagements in 2020, we did observe them using the Mimikatz credential harvesting tool with the exact same binary file name. Gold Melody have used reconnaissance commands to enumerate user and network information throughout their intrusion, and they're all fairly similar. In only 1 case did we observe successful lateral movement, and that was using PA-exec, which is an open source tool that claims the capabilities of PSExec, which allows access through, to hosts through the use of SMB. And obviously, as I said on the most recent engagement, we did observe the group using the TX port map tool to identify SMB port hosts. So it was likely that that was potentially a next step, and they may have succeeded had alerts not forced host isolation and containment of the compromise. So in terms of execution, Gold Melody have used wget again, but they also used the audit tunnel reverse proxy tool to attempt to execute commands on hosts remotely. And in July 2020, we also observed them use the GoTroj Trojan, and this is reported in open source as used by Gold Melody as well. We only observed successful exfiltration on 1 intrusion, and this was on the 1st in July 2020 when the group used PuTTY to extract the Windows system registry Hive and also the ntds.dit Active Directory database file. So crossovers between these intrusions were not limited to TTPs. As you can see from this slide, command and control IP addresses were shared across some intrusions and also linked in CrowdStrike and Mandiant's reporting to their aliases for Gold Melody. So onto Gold MATADOR. This is the affiliate of the Hive Ransomware as a service scheme. We've observed them active since April 2022 across 4 separate engagements. And in 2 of those cases, ransomware was successfully deployed. In 1, alerts were generated by a third-party vendor, but not acted upon by the victim, mainly because they lacked enough context to do so. In the 2nd, Taegis XDR did alert to the presence of malicious activity, but it wasn't properly rolled out to all hosts, and so there was some residual Cobalt Strike access left after host isolation, so ransomware was deployed, albeit in a very limited way. In the 2 where ransomware was not successfully deployed, Taegis XDR alerts generated alerts to the victim that successfully initiated host isolation, containment of the compromise, and obviously severely limited the impact of the attack. So I'm going to describe a recent intrusion where we solved Gold MATADOR activity, and we identified initial access in May 2022. And access was obtained using valid credentials for 3 accounts on the Citrix application directory controller, and this was accessed through an SSL VPN connection. The connection through the IP address used to access the SSL VPN was associated in open source with previous Hive ransomware intrusions. It wasn't properly established exactly how the threat actor obtained these credentials, however, but the accounts were only protected with single-factor authentication. From the Citrix ADC server, incident responders assessed that the threat actor likely moved laterally to a Citrix XenApp server where they were able to escalate privileges and gain access to an administrator account. This wasn't definitively established because that server was actually part of a virtualized environment that was ultimately encrypted by the ransomware, but it seems like a likely path given the evidence. So interestingly on this engagement, while moving directly to a domain controller using that acquired administrator account, unknown behavior by the threat actor generated a terminal services error event. And this error event, as you can see from that slide, actually captured the host name for the threat actor's virtual machine. And this is important, and I'll come back to this later. So having moved to the domain controller, the threat actor downloaded and installed Cobalt Strike, and then they continued to move laterally to numerous hosts in other countries, which included file servers and multiple domain controllers. The threat actor also installed System BC, which is a remote access Trojan that provides persistent backdoor access and also acts as a network proxy in order to conceal CT communications. To further evade detection, the group also ran the PC Hunter tool, and this is a tool, a legitimate tool that can be used to access hundreds of system settings and was originally designed to identify the presence of malware and rootkits, but can be used to terminate processes, including antivirus. The group also attempted to use FileZilla for data exfiltration, or at least executed it, and it was connecting to an IP address that has been previously associated with Hive ransomware activity. However, no evidence of actual data exfiltration attempts, successful data exfiltration was observed in this engagement. So, delivery of the ransomware. The binary itself was saved to the sysvol folder, and this was on a domain controller. And this folder is used to deploy policies and scripts to any hosts that are part of a domain. A group policy was then created. A group policy object was then created to deliver a scheduled task to hosts, and it used the VM update scheduled task to do so. And VM update is a legitimate tool designed for recovery and data management. And this was designed to execute the ransomware binary from the shared location. Interestingly here, the first part of the argument was actually the victim username for the Hive negotiation portal, and the second part was the password. The ransom note was then delivered to local machines to the C drive. In addition, the threat actor used SSH to log into a VMware ESXi device to also deploy the ransomware. And again, the first and second parts of the encryption routine included the victim Hive, the negotiation portal username, and then also the password. So, what characterises these Gold MATADOR intrusions, and what makes them? What categorises Gold MATADOR intrusions, and what was common to the 4 intrusions that we observed that enables us to attribute activity to them? Well, first and foremost, you might recognise that host name that we observed in the error log. Well, this was seen on all 4 of the intrusions we observed. Now, host names are not necessarily great indicators, simply because a threat actor might use a different virtual machine for each intrusion, or if they do use the same virtual machine, they might change the host name to avoid indicator-based detections, but obviously in this case they persistently used it. They also deployed Cobalt Strike. Well, clearly it's a very common tool, so that's not necessarily indicative of the same group. But in this case, in 3 of the 4 intrusions, that Cobalt Strike beacon communicated with the same C2 IP address. Similarly, for System BC, we observed that deployed twice, and in that case, it was actually the exact same hash value for the binary and also the C2 IP address that was communicated with. And finally, in the 2 successful deliveries of ransomware, they used group policy to deliver a scheduled task. So finally, the group I'm going to talk about is Gold Hideaway, and this group has been active since at least June 2021. And we observed this group's activity in an intrusion where they deployed Lockbit ransomware, and we noted at the same time that the infrastructure was used in a June 2021 likely REvil deployment that was identified by our CTU colleagues in Japan. So I'm talking about the second incident involving Lockbit, which this is the one that our incident responders looked at. We observed Gold Hideaway access the victim network in July 2021, and the group used SEO poisoning to drive victim traffic to a malicious URL. So in this case, the victim conducted a Google search for a work-related document and then responded to one of those search results that led to a compromised WordPress site that hosted a zip file contained with a name that was almost identical to the search term, and that zip file contained a malicious JavaScript file. They then downloaded that zip file, executed the JavaScript file. This is very, very similar to a previous engagement where REvil was deployed, similar technique, and also it's remarkably similar to bootloader delivery. My colleague Keith Jarvis is going to talk more about that later on. So having downloaded the archive file, the victim executed the JavaScript file, which in turn created ultimately a persistent Cobalt Strike beacon backdoor on the user's device. And I'm going to cover this in a bit more detail later on, as it's quite an interesting deployment. So after this, the threat actor was able to obtain administrator credentials, although the method here wasn't established. The threat actor then moved laterally to 2 servers, one of which was a domain controller using Remote Desktop Protocol, RDP. There was an attempt to exfiltrate data, but this apparently failed, and they tried to run free file sync on one of the devices on the domain controller. However, the log event suggested that it was an incompatible version of free file sync was installed on the operating system, and so it didn't execute. And interestingly here as well, the Dropbox account was actually created using the victim's email address, but this does not appear to have been used. So from the same domain controller, the threat actor used the advanced IP scanner to enumerate the network, and then 1 week later they disabled antivirus. They deployed the ransomware from the domain controller, and this resulted in the encryption of that domain controller and then 3 further endpoints. And the ransom note was then delivered to all network printers through a technique called print bombing. So let's go back to look in more detail at the technique Gold Hideaway used to deploy Cobalt Strike. This is the element that actually enables us to link to it to previous RaaS intrusions. So how was Cobalt Strike deployed? Well, once executed from the downloaded zip file, the JavaScript file bundled into it checks for and creates a specific registry key, and it then downloads, decrypts, and executes PowerShell script from one of 3 malicious domains, which I'll come on to shortly. The PowerShell script is base64 encoded, and its function is to convert 4 values in the run once registry key, and this creates a .NET binary with 1 single function, and that function is to then take a number of values from the registry and compile the Cobalt Strike beacon. So I mentioned 3 domains that were used to host the malicious script. There they are. And the PowerShell script itself was hosted on a URL string that bore that construction. So I mentioned crossover with the previous June 2021 intrusion. These are the 3 domains that were observed in precursor activity to a RaaS deployment. Again, this was identified by our CTU colleagues in Japan. You will note that 2 of these domains are identical to those used 1 month later in the Lockbit intrusion. And also, although not identical, the URL was also of a similar form. So these domains were also identified in open source as connected to RaaS deployments, and the JavaScript file identified in the June 2021 incident was almost identical to a JavaScript file identified in open source as connected to other RaaS deployments. And we surmised at this time, particularly given the timing of it, that it was likely a RaaS ransomware affiliate that had moved to Lockbit after the RaaS ransomware operation was temporarily shuttered on July the 13th. So to sum up, context is key in our process. We need to build an understanding of the phases of an attack that occur prior to a ransomware deployment so that we can track TTPs and attribute them to specific threat groups and the role they perform in the ransomware ecosystem. In identifying the threat groups, we can then make predictions about what might be coming next and when it might happen, and then obviously what we can do to mitigate the threat. And then finally, before I hand back over to Jules, what's really important, of course, is delivering this TII to our customers. And this means through tracking the TTPs and attributing to specific threat groups, we can provide meaningful context in our alerts that makes it more likely network defenders will respond to enriched alerts generated from network or endpoint detections. So that's what I have for you on ransomware today, Jules.
Tim, that was such a comprehensive idea of what your process is. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
Just before I let you escape my studio, do you mind if I ask you just one kind of follow-up question?
Okay.
I really appreciate you talking us through the process there. And I mean, that final case study there about Gold Hideaway was both terrifying and illuminating. I wonder, how confident are you in your attribution process and what you've done so far? So obviously different groups, probably different confidence levels. I think it comes really down to data points. So obviously with the Gold Melody stuff, we observed an awful lot across those 5 intrusions that pointed to the same group. So I think we can say with higher confidence that we think it was them. The complication with ransomware, of course, is that they very often release playbooks to their affiliates. So you might think it's one affiliate when actually it could be a different affiliate that's using the same playbook. So I guess certainly with the final group, Gold Hideaway, perhaps a bit less confidence. But as for the Hive affiliate group, Gold Matador, and the first group, I think pretty confident it's them involved. Got it. So you're talking about sharing kind of the resources, I suppose, and then that throws you off.
Exactly. So where the data points come in, it's not necessarily just TTPs. If that then coincides with certain infrastructure being reused by the same, then we can probably conclude that it's the same group involved.
What other challenges would you say that have cropped up in your process in kind of attributing ransomware attacks?
I think it's that. I think it's the fact that playbooks have been released. I mean, people may remember that last year Conti's playbook was exposed, I think around about July or August last year, where they were basically giving instructions to affiliates of how to breach networks. So if you see this continued use, you might assume, well, it's the same group, when in fact it's a different group that's using the same playbook.
They make your job interesting.
They do.
At least there's that, right? And it gives us lots of materials to talk about in these summits. Tim, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's such a comprehensive insight into your learning there. Thank you.